Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Writers Center. Thank you for coming to our LGBTQ panel discussion. Before we jump into introductions and everything, just a show of hands, who has never been here before? Woo, great. Well, welcome again. Yeah, round of applause for that. On your seats, you'll find something that's a little flyer that says the Writer Center Live. It's a variety show that we're doing at the end of the month. Definitely come check that out. It'll be a little bit more energetic than your typical reading. We'll do some fun music and all kinds of different stuff going on, so it'll be really fun. And then on the back table, we have our Writer's Guide, which is an overview of our workshops for the summer schedule. We do about 300 workshops a year here, in addition to all the free events that we host like these. We do a monthly open mic, so definitely grab one of those. They're free for everyone. There's some fun interviews and stuff like that with local authors as well, so it's a good resource for everyone too. And then I'll just start with an introduction of myself, and I'll let each of our panelists kind of introduce themselves as well, and then we'll get this thing started. So my name's Emily. I am the managing editor of Poet Lore, the poetry magazine that we publish here at the Writers Center. I'm also a poet myself, and I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. I'm kind of honored that I get to do this. And I will be starting a graduate program at American University in the fall. Last thing I'll throw in there, I use the pronouns she, her, so just gonna put that out there, and then I'll let Cheryl start. Yeah.
I'm Cheryl Head. Thank you for coming tonight. Appreciate seeing all of you. I live on Capitol Hill. It was a long drive here in rush hour, but fun. I've been writing about 9 years, focused on fiction. Before that, I was working in public broadcasting at WETA for a long time, and for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And I love writing fiction now. I've always been doing storytelling, but this is now my new vehicle for telling the stories that are important to me, or that pique my interest. Thanks for coming.
Hi, I'm Angelique Palmer. I am a competitive poet I live in Northern Virginia now, in a little hollow called Vienna. Have you heard of it? I am a teacher by day, and I'm currently in the summer camp season, so if you see a little paint on me, okay, we understand each other, great. And I am a competitive poet, which means that for a long time I wrote for Poetry Slam, and that was a very successful vehicle for me. And then I wrote this book, so I do both worlds now, and she, her are also my pronouns.
Hi everyone, I'm Derrick Jefferson. My friends call me D. I am a research librarian on the faculty at American University, and I'm also a fiction and nonfiction writer. I'm glad to be here and see these faces tonight. Thanks so much for coming out. Inevitable pronouns, he and him. All right, keep it moving.
Hi, thanks for coming everybody, and thank you to the Writers Center for having us. My name is Aaron Hamburger. I'm a fiction and nonfiction writer, and I have attempted I teach poetry writing, but I don't write poetry. You don't want to see my book. And so I've written 3 books. The first one's called The View from Stalin's Head. The second one's called Faith for Beginners. And my newest one is Nirvana is Here, and it has just come out. And there are piles of all of our books on the back table, and our goal is for them to be gone by the end of the night. And if you ask very nicely, or even not so nicely, I'm sure we'd all be happy to sign them for you.
Cash App, Venmo, all of those.
Alrighty, thank you guys. So just to frame the conversation a little bit before we kind of deep dive into the questions, I first just wanted to thank Aaron again for kind of kickstarting this get together, and then to everyone else on the panel for being part of this discussion here. I think we're so fortunate to be able to have this space that we can gather and discuss, literature, where it's been, where it's going, especially within the LGBTQ community. I think it's also important that we remember that we haven't always been able to have a space like this. We haven't always, had a Pride Month or a Pride Parade. And I just want to take some time to remember those that broke that barrier for us. So, it's Stonewall 50 this year, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera. I think we wouldn't be anywhere without them. And then let's also not forget that yesterday marked 3 years since the Pulse shooting in Orlando. And then even still, we have at least 10 transgender women of color who have been murdered in the United States this year. So, just kind of calling back that history. We haven't always had this space, but there's still so much more that we have to do. So I think the first question then, as we jump right in, is just going to talk a little bit about genre and, how we each got introduced to LGBTQ writing. What was your first exposure to that writing, that history that you kind of came into as you started writing your own different genres, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and then what impact does that continue to have on your own writing? I don't know, who wants to start? Cold call.
Oh, everyone's looking at me.
Aaron.
So I remember being very young and occasionally, very furtively, looking in the card catalog, because that was in the days when libraries had card catalogs, under like H, and then I was like, homosexuality, and actually my local library had a book by Edmund White called States of Desire, which was his, and I remember one chapter was set in Washington, D.C., and it's about his travels all over, and I remember he described seeing like two men in the street look at each other, and then they went home with each other, like without a word. And I just remember being totally startled by that in, suburban Detroit in the Midwest. But I remember going to college and starting to reckon with my identity. And because I was always a writer and always interested in literature, I was very interested in finding gay stories. And it was hard to find them. And this was before the internet, and, there just weren't like a ton of resources. But I do remember very clearly reading the novel Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson, and just thinking, I want a voice like that, because it was so fearless, so bold, and so true. And it felt like, I felt like there were a lot of books that were out there that were maybe gay themed, but maybe not so beautifully written. And I felt like it was both like very fierce in its, where it stood politically, but also just like a fierce work of literature. And I still think it's her best book. I mean, she's written some great books since then, but it's still my favorite by hers, so.
Great. I guess we'll move to Derrick.
I was gonna say I stumbled into my homosexuality. That is not the case. I had full intention. I remember, I grew up in Southern California, and I remember, we had like a little, very detailed, bookshelf, and I remember reading The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And this is in the age of me being angry and listening to a lot of like NWA and Public Enemy and wanting to burn everything down and rebelling against, society. And I remember being empowered by it. It's James Baldwin, we know him, certainly growing up, my parents from the South, knowing this kind of, he is like one of our iconic people. And so I remember really being kind of like invigorated by The Fire Next Time. And then I remember stumbling like I said, oh, James Baldwin, what is this Giovanni's Room? And didn't quite connect the dots because A, it was a fictional book and not nonfiction. It wasn't a collection of essays. But then, clearly Giovanni's Room is this gay Parisian love story. And what really shook me in hindsight, I was like, but James, this is the same James Baldwin? Because I was like, but he's writing about white people. And I didn't know, I was like, can black people write about white people? Like, I was like, there isn't a black person in this book. They're gay, like they're doing stuff. And so I really remember there was like a fissure between James Baldwin coming out, and my parents certainly like fled the South in this kind of Civil Rights Act era, and wrapping my head around this kind of empowering, angry, fiercely black writer, and then kind of reconciling that was the same person. I mean, now we talk about like intersectionality, and it's all over the place, and it's almost kind of, I hope it's not losing its impact, but we hear it so much. But I really remember being wowed by that that juxtaposition of those two parts of Baldwin's identity. And so I think I really do probably still kind of embody, wanting to burn everything down, but also like make out with guys. I mean, it's the whole thing. So I think that's really where it kicked off for me.
I think I'm next. I have to follow that. So I'll say Mama Audra, Audra Lorde, and that I had to kind of claw my way out of a closeted life and just admit some incredible truths to myself kind of late in life, and then just live it without giving an F word. Can we say F words?
Go for it.
Okay.
That's fine.
Without giving an F word. and I think without Sister Outsider, not just in my hand, but in my ears, like listening to it while riding the train back and forth to DC and getting it into my skin and into my muscle memory. I needed that as a person who was older and coming out, and then be able to stand in my queerness and be firm in that. But if we want to talk about an awakening, Head Off and Split was just, I had the biggest crush, right? So I'm reading a book because I have a crush on a woman, and then I'm reading the poems and I'm going, I want to do that with words. I want to be able to do that with words. I've since seen many, many readings, and I still want to do that with words. And I do things with words now. I affirm the fact that I'm actually a really good poet, and that was hard to say about 5 years ago. But even if it were true, that was hard to say 5 years ago, I will say now, I'm a pretty good poet, and I'm still very interested in learning more and more about my craft. And I think that that's what Nikki Finney really embodies is, on top of being socially aware, I'm going to continue to bring you craft, and then Adrienne Rich. And so I think I've mentioned the Trinity right there. I'm going to stop. It's been lovely having me.
So I was on the other side of Detroit from Aaron. I was on the east side of Detroit, and growing up at a time when I didn't know what gay meant, and especially as a young black girl in Detroit, I had no clue what it meant. So I was in college, even though I had fallen in love with my cousin and several movie stars in the interim. When I went to college, someone said, "Oh, you should read this." And it turned out to be Catherine Forrest's Curious Wine. And I thought, oh my God, there are other people like me, and you just, the release that it gives you. I didn't think about writing fiction, although I've always written poetry badly, but you know how we always write poetry in our journals. But I've always written something. And 10 years ago, I decided I needed to write a story that was important to me, and so that's what got me started writing fiction.
Awesome. So I think something that kind of came from everyone's conversation is this idea that we had to kind of go search it out and go hunt for it, and maybe it wasn't always right there on the surface. So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about that idea that these narratives or even these themes that hopefully, we try to bring in our writing, do we still feel the pressure to bury those a little bit? Or do we feel in this moment a little bit more free to put those at the forefront of our books or poems?
So I actually have a story connected with that. When I was first starting out with writing, and I got an MFA, and I remember thinking, I want to be the gay writer that straight people also read. I want to be that, that bridge kind of thing. And so I had this idea that if I could write about gay characters and straight characters and kind of mix them up, In fact, my second book is a novel, and like half of it is from the point of view of a young gay man, and half of it is from a straight woman. And I thought, great, I can get like the Ann Tyler fans, and I can get like the gay literature fans, and just get them together in a room. And what I found was like that for the publishing industry, that doesn't quite work. It's like a teeny drop of gayness in the water makes all the water gay. And so it wasn't like I thought. Yeah. Which like today, is a different thing. But so I thought, oh, if I write a book that has like, for example, gay content and Jewish content, you could market it to gay audiences and Jewish audiences. Mm-hmm. But instead, what my publisher said is, no, we need to market it only to people who are both gay and Jewish, which I just thought was so limiting. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting with this book, I thought, well, I'm just going to write the story that I just feel like writing, and I'm not even going to worry about those things. And it's interesting how many people have written to me who are not gay and say, I can relate to that, because ultimately we're all human. Mm-hmm. And so I think we can relate to any narrative. It doesn't matter. And sometimes I find I can actually relate more to narratives that maybe like I don't necessarily, like I'm not a lesbian, but I felt like I really resonated with Jeanette Winterson's story. And there are ways in which sometimes I read like a gay male story, and I'm like, I don't resonate with that in the same way. It's not an automatic.
Did anyone want to add?
Well, in my first book, which was not mystery, I write a mystery series now, but the first book was historical fiction, and it looked at the Negro soldiers' experience during World War II, which is an important story for me to tell because my father was in World War II. And all the stories I'd seen were about soldiers in glory, because that's the stories you see about World War II, the people who were in battle and who were courageous in battle. But the fact of the matter is 80% of Negro soldiers, black soldiers in the 40s, weren't allowed to go to the fronts. They were serving in menial tasks in bases stateside. And so the courage it took to do that job in a segregated army, I thought was a story that ought to be told. So I'm writing this story, I'm going along writing this story over many years, and one of the characters said to me, this sergeant who's kind of hard-bitten, mean soldier who felt it was his duty to get all these other soldiers ready for battle if they ever got into battle, woke me up in the early mornings and said, I'm gay, right? And I thought, oh my God, you are? And then but it made sense to me once he told me that, And I guess what I took away from that is, as a lesbian writer, even though I'm not specifically writing a story that's about the lesbian experience, I'm going to want to represent the world as a place where lots of LGBTQ people live and thrive and work and dream, and so it'll always come out.
Yeah, I'm always curious about this idea of even if these themes aren't present in the work, but we're coming from that perspective as LGBTQ identified writers, then are we inherently making our writing queer? And I get this a lot from my family, like, why does everything you write have to be gay? But it's not always, but I think because we're coming from that lens of perspective, then it kind of bends that way. And then maybe the people that know us the best see it that way, but then an outside reader, probably not.
I think there's something about being othered in some capacity that lends yourself to be an empathetic and a sensitive person to people who have a disability, to someone who has an accent, to someone who's an immigrant. I grew up in San Diego on the border. My stepmother is half Mexican. I have a brother who's autistic. It's like I feel like I have this kind of like checklist of things that I've had to deal with in my life. I don't, necessarily write lesbian fiction, but I certainly know lesbians, and I know what it's like to be kind of dismissed and have eyes cast askew because of who I am when I walk into a room. I think all of these kinds of things inform that. I think that there's a sensitivity that I probably naturally have, but certainly as a queer person of color, it has only deepened that kind of empathy and encourages me to kind of open my heart up to people who are othered or who are different. And I think that's probably the case with a lot of kind of other queer identified writers.
I do think, though, we can think of another number of examples of some people who queerness didn't have that effect on them, and actually think of like someone like Roy Cohn, and it's like you would think that it would have that effect on people, and there are certain people whose hearts are just hardened for whatever reason. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. So to kind of shift the conversation a little bit towards kind of that pop culture representation, and you two have been working in television prior, and I know, Aaron, your book has to deal with music, and I know that pop culture is everywhere, and we see so much more of that kind of visibility now with social media and Twitter, and I feel like I'm in this like queer writer Twitter bubble where I'm like, oh my gosh, everybody's queer, but that's just the people I follow. But I think if you could just talk about both of your perspective working in television, working in that public sphere, and how does that influence your writing at all, and how you kind of shift, or working on the stage as a performing poet and slam competitions and that kind of thing.
So my one and only rank that I hold is that in 2015, I was the 5th placed woman in the whole entire world of poetry. Okay, the whole entire world who paid to compete in that particular poetry slam. But still, it's big, it's huge. It's also, my friend Denise Jolly on that particular occasion in Albuquerque, New Mexico said, yes, this is the queerest festival that Poetry Slam International runs, because we are all there free enough to tell our narrative. I loved going to WALPS, which is the acronym for it, because I was like, oh, great. It's like, and forgive the crass analogy, it's like being able to take your bra off, and you just, when you get home and you do that one-handed bra, get off! Only for 5 whole days straight, and I liked that. The opposite of that was working for WSVN in Miami, because God love them, they are probably still very good at what they do. They were great at what they did at the time, and I was on the fast track, and I was so burnt out by the time I left. To the point where I used to cry in the car before I got out of the car to go into work. I don't want to tell you who did what on American Idol. I don't want to know what Britney Spears did with her underwear. I don't. And I honestly don't want to tell you another story about Carly Brusha, who's an 11-year-old walking home from school and disappeared and was never heard from again. My daughter was 11 at that point in time. I couldn't breathe writing that story, and I couldn't breathe for months after that story. And when my sister said, if you bring, my daughter's name is Magali, if you bring Magali to Virginia, I will pay for her education, just get the heck out of there. And she didn't say heck. And so I came here, and the only thing that I could do is to sit down and work on the book. Again, a lot of terrible poems, but the poems started to come, and I started to feel good enough to take my bra off, to breathe. And I don't mind not going back that way.
I feel like we have a moment in time where the whole world is looking at queerness as such a wonderful thing, and they wish they could be queer. Just like, remember when there were young white boys who wanted to be like hip hop stars? It feels like the world now wants to be queer, And so we've got polls on TV, we've got African American directors and writers doing big, well-known, successful movies and films and TVs. And I think it's not just a trend. I think in the past, we've had these diversity bubbles that have been trends, and I think it's here to stay this time, both for people of color and people who are queer and people who are differently able, and all the diversity categories. Because I think people are finally saying, oh, the world is changing, change is hard, but I better get with the program, you know?
You know, I'm a huge fan of The Daily, the podcast from the New York Times. I don't know if any of you listen to that. And they're doing this incredible series this week. I recommend everybody subscribe and listen to it, where they're going around Europe to track the nationalist movements in all these different countries. And so in today's episode, they were actually in Poland, and they went to visit the city of Gdansk, where the mayor was very conservative for years and years and years. And then they got this nationalist government in charge that was very anti-LGBT. And the mayor said, you know what, that's not right. And so he marched for the first time in his city's gay pride parade. And not long afterward, he was stabbed and he died. You know, and so, you know, it's this crazy moment, like Cheryl is saying, like we have so much more visibility, so much more acceptance. I mean, I teach a fiction writing class at George Washington University, and like a good third of my students were somewhere in the LGBT spectrum, and the ones who weren't, like, almost felt left out. And like in workshop, people would say, "Can you just like make that character gay? It would be so much better." And I was like, "Yeah, make the character gay." You know, like when I was in workshop, nobody was saying that. I was like very nervous, you know, if I showed some. So it's this really weird. It's like, you know, we're coming so far. You know, and then, you know, you see like the vice president like boasting about like, oh, we nixed gay pride flags on embassies all around the world. You know, it's a real double take kind of moment, and I don't even know how to wrap my head around it. Yes.
Yeah, it's almost like we are in this little cultural bubble where we see the people who are continually putting in the effort and doing the most to make sure that these stories are heard, and, you know, these marginalized identities are being talked about and being put on film and put on TV. But then, you know, the people in power, you know, has that back and forth. So it's a great example.
But you know, I think it's like Trump's 30 to 40%. There are going to be those people that hold on for dear life. I really want to understand why people support him. I mean, and I don't mean it facetiously. I really want to understand what makes that tick, you know, what makes you tick around that issue. Because it's about fear, you know, and so as we are growing and changing and, you know, flowering, there's, you know, you're fighting for your life on the other side. People are just saying, life is changing too dramatically for me. I'm pushing back. I'm burning flags. I'm peeing on the Israeli flag. I'm beating people up in Charlottesville. You know, it's horrifying, you know.
And I think while we're talking a little bit about, you know, that kind of political fear that I think a lot of us are feeling, you know, there's always that question, well, what can we do? Like, why are you writing? Why aren't you doing something else? So I wonder if you guys can talk about, you know, do you feel kind of pressured to use the platform that you've created to kind of go on that political edge? Or, you know, how does that kind of influence your work as, you know, we're writing in the Trump era kind of thing?
I find so much solace in writing, and even, I mean, we're in DC and we're at, you know, kind of ground zero and all that. I saw my doctor yesterday, and she was like, "Baby, I'm moving. I'm leaving. I'm moving to Atlanta." And I was like, "Why?" And she was like, it's too much. And so I totally respect that decision. But I think how I push back is to write. Like, I feel like there isn't anything that I can do better than write. And if I couldn't do that, then I don't want to do anything. And there's such power, I think, in the word and how we express ourselves, that it can be our ammunition. You know, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, some people, this is DC people, we love a protest, we love to march. I do not. You know, but I'm really good with a pen and a pad. you know, and it is, and, you know, if I'm channeling, you know, great Jimmy Baldwin, you know, maybe that's, yeah, I'm getting some strength from that, but there's something about the ability and talent and skill and craft of putting together words on a page that makes me feel like I can continue to put one foot in front of the other.
I want to be a little bit redundant here in that I am operating in my gift. To operate outside of my gift would be a slap in the face to the person who gave, or the thing that gave me my gift. I'm also not going to swerve out of my lane. I don't do well at protests. I don't do well with, I'm saying this for the 50th time in a row, we're good with chanting this over and over, okay. I'm not that person. I'm a better writer than most of the chants that they're doing too. So I'm like, let's go, let's edit.
I need you to write the chants.
I also
Need poets.
Revisions.
Let's go. Yes. I also used to say that when the revolution actually comes, they're going to need somebody to cook. I'm really good with a spoon. I know what seasoning is. I mean, I'm gonna operate in my gift because that is the gift of turning 40. It's like I'm not gonna do what I'm not good at anymore, and I'm really good at this, and I'm kind of good at this, and I can get better at that. So being loud and queer, and I have this booming voice and this amazing stage presence, this part swan, part panther, I can get you. And I can get you to listen. So that's how I'm going to operate.
I looked at one of your videos. You really are powerful.
I appreciate you.
So Joseph Stalin called writers engineers of the human souls. And, you know, every dictator knows, like, one of the first things that you do when you get into power is you control the press, you control the writers, and you stop them from speaking. So after the election in 2016, like, I am also not a particularly political I was like the least political person in DC. Maybe we're all like least political. But I was like, no more, I got to get political. And so I didn't even know, I knew I wanted to do something, I didn't know what to do. So I just signed up for like every liberal thing that I could sign up for. And sure enough, came flooding in, go here, do this, do that. And suddenly I was like marching and waving signs, painting signs. And so the AWP convention was here in DC in 2017, and they were asking writers to go visit all the senators in Congress because arts funding was on the chopping block, and also to advocate for just different stuff. And so I feel very strong. I'm from a family of immigrants, and I feel very strongly about immigrant rights. And so I brought a picture of my grandmother with me, and I went to visit Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan. And I was like, who am I? You know, and I'm in line with all these like lobbyists, or like wearing suits and ties, and they have like, you know, printed folders, and I'm just standing there just like Joe Schmo with a picture of my grandmother. And so it was my turn. I went up and I spoke to the senator, and I said, this is my grandmother. I wanted you to hear her story. She came from, you know, the former Soviet Union. She was a refugee. There was the equivalent of the Muslim ban. It was the Jewish ban in the 20s, and she couldn't get in, and she tried to sneak into the country, and she was caught and deported to Cuba. And eventually she did make it in legally, and she married my grandfather, and they ran a grocery store and led wonderful lives. They're upstanding citizens. And so I just feel very strongly we need to protect immigrant rights. And the senator said, I agree with you 100%. And I thought, well, that was easy. And then I said, well, what can I do? You know, I'm a writer, but what can I do to support you? And I thought she would say, march in the streets, raise money. And she said, tell your grandmother's story. I was so shocked by that. But I think that's really, really important. Like, this happened. This was real. I am here. This is how I feel. This is how I see this experience. That's incredibly important. So the work that we're doing is not like extra or by the way. It's in the battlefield. It's right there.
Great. I want to pivot a little bit to talk about, you know, how we craft those stories. Just a little bit about, you know, when you're beginning the poem or the story or the novel or mystery, you know, what steps do you take, and who is your community? Like, who reads your work in its first drafts? Do you have people that read your work in your first drafts? How do you kind of polish that up? What's your revision process like? Just to kind of get in your heads a little bit.
Well, I'll start. So I'm writing mysteries, and I love to read mysteries, so it really comes easy to me, frankly. But I do a combination of plotting and pantsing. So I've discovered that I need to first write the story without having too much down on paper. But once I get a germ of the idea and understand the characters, and I have recurring characters, but I'm bringing in new characters, then I have to plot. And I think for a mystery, it's important for me that there's lots of logic, that I'm explaining the motivation of both the protagonists and the villains, that you as readers don't know who did it too early in the book. I really work hard at that. I like to have twists and turns. And at the same time, I want to tell a story that's kind of a human story that connects us, and it speaks to the kind of themes that I always want to write about, which are diversity and tolerance and empathy that we've all been talking about. So I do have early readers. I'm in a writing club that really does help me. This is one of my writing club members, and I remember giving her a short story, and I said, the character said something like, well, catfishing, I just don't get it. And she said in her critique, and neither do I. So, it really helps to have another person, and it made such sense to me, So that's one of my techniques, and then I do have some beta readers and sometimes subject matter readers. I'll tell you sometime about the time I tied myself up for that book cover over there to see how you could get out of a noose on your back.
For a long time when I was competing, I knew that there was a season. There's a competitive poetry season. It starts in September, kind of ends around April. All summer you get ready, and then August you go to the national. And so like I said earlier, I usually competed in the Women of the World, which happens in March. So somewhere around September, I'm already writing for that. When I knew that there wasn't going to be a WOWS this year, I slacked off. I was so upset with myself. I'm like, it's September. I should be writing. I should be editing. And what I realized is I did a lot of navel gazing, a lot of writing about myself and about my journey and about me, about my queerness, about my oldness, about my mamaness. And after a while, I'm like, do I have anything else to say? And there's also that portion of me is like, it's okay to say, no, I don't have anything else to talk about. Not yet, anyway. But I did have a few other things to say. And so when it got down to writing not competitively, the things I gave to my friend Simone Roberts, who edited my book, was like, yeah, this needs another pass. I'm like, huh? What does that mean? The stuff that I did competitively, that I'll continue to do competitively sometime soon, I would send to a different person. Douglas Powell, whose stage name is Roscoe Burnham's. Do not ask me why. I don't know. He has the best ear for things that happened in the moment, because when you're doing things competitively, you don't have a chance to go, hey, read that line again. Nope, you get the one shot. And if they don't get it, they missed your whole entire thesis of your poem or what you're talking about, then you're done. And so those are the people that I bounce things off of for real. But the germ starts, since you asked, with how does this affect me? And the whole, I don't want to have to tell this whole story, but I'll do it as quickly as I possibly can. I went to a writing retreat called A Room of Her Own. It happens all the way in New Mexico, in Abiquiu, on the Ghost Ranch. And a whole bunch of women, a couple of days, we write. I ended up in a class with Lauren Rusk, who I'd never heard of before, and Adora Now. And what Lauren said at the beginning of the class was, oh no, it wasn't the beginning. We were deep into critiques now and in groups and stuff. And she leaned back because my classmate had said, "You're supposed to write about what you know." And she leaned back and she said, "Writing about what you know is boring. Write about what you don't know about what you know. That takes investigation." And so that's my germ. Like, what don't I know about this? And that's the fun part, the investigation.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I'm a research librarian, and I think that's not an accident. I'm curious by nature, right? And so I'm like, oh, the North Atlantic swordfish. What is house? Is that a sustainable fish? Coming soon. No, but my training, it was in screenwriting. I have an MFA in film, and so my goal was to really kind of write and produce for television. And in those situations, in those settings, you can be in a writing room on a set, and they can be filming and then decide, you know what, this isn't working. And so we have an hour, but we're doing this now. So we need those pages now. And so you are on, like you're at the beck and call of the producers. So with that, I think that my strength has always been in character and in voice. You know, you may come in on a show and I don't know, Ross on Friends. Like, I think Ross should die on Friends, frankly. But Ross is problematic. But you have to, like, someone else created that character, but you have to be able to kind of take on that persona and write for that voice. So I think that really helped me to quickly come up with ideas and stuff. But I think because I'm naturally a curious person, I am always spurred on by, like, well, what would happen if? What would it be like if? Or a lot of times, like, I'll read something and be really excited about how a story is going, and then start to kind of, I'm like, oh, I could do better. Wouldn't it be interesting if it was this kind of a story? And so I feel like it's a combination of all of those kinds of things, but it certainly almost always starts with this kind of curiosity, this spark of curiosity.
I love that question. Wouldn't it be interesting if it were this kind of story? I think that is like the number one question. Whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction or poetry, any genre, wouldn't it be interesting if it were this kind of story? And I think being able to liberate yourself from your initial conception of the work is so key to bringing it forward. So for me, I always start with a sense of setting. And for me, the question of setting involves both the question of where, but also of when. Because I can tell you from personal experience, New York City on September 10th, 2001 was a very different place from New York City on September 11th, 2001. And so I think it's very crucial for me to know both, like, where is the story set, but then when. And that was something for my novel, Nirvana Is Here, which was incredibly important because I knew, I actually tried to make it a more contemporary story, and it didn't work for a number of reasons, but mainly because I still am coming to terms with, like, what the hell Twitter is. So I'm like, okay, maybe I'm not the best person to write about that particular time period. And not only, it's interesting what you were saying, write about what you know. The writer Jean Auel, who wrote the Clan of the Cave Bear series, because people would say, write about what you know, but you didn't live in, like, cave person time, so how do you write about that? And she said, well, you can write about what you know, or you can know about what you write. But the key is you have to be interested enough to find out. And I'm just not that interested in Twitter. So, so I knew I wanted to be, 80s, 90s, which was also the time when I was young and coming of age. And then I found that, so the band Nirvana, their breakout song, Smells Like Teen Spirit, it came out September of 1991. And Kurt Cobain killed himself in April of 1994. So that created this, like, 3-year time span. And I thought, that's an interesting frame. That's an interesting vessel or shape for this action. And then what I can do is, like, the reader knows, like, okay, I've got, like, a limited amount of time with Kurt Cobain. Kurt Cobain is not in the plot, it's just, like, the background, but it's like, it helps to propel the story forward. And then I also, the story goes back and forth in time, but the past period takes place during high school. So everybody knows sophomore years followed by junior years, followed by senior years. So it's another way to, like, keep the story moving forward. So I feel like, you start with, at least for fiction, you start with the sense of like place, and then you move from place to shape. Like how can you use both setting in terms of where, but also in terms of when, to create the boundaries of your narrative. I studied with the poet Thylius Moss, who talked a lot about the importance of limits for an artist. And it's interesting, it harkens back to the beginning of our discussion about like, there was a time when like we couldn't be having this discussion. And yet, you know, you had people like Marcel Proust, you know, like it didn't stop him from writing about same-sex desire. So, you know, sometimes those limits and actually coming up against them can create that creative friction and a spark.
And Emily, you talked about who's reading the work that we're doing. So writing mysteries is, there's a huge mystery fan base. There are big conferences that are held around the country, just like with Poetry Slam. And mysteries are dominated by white men, as many things are. God bless them. And I read all those mysteries by white men and loved the tropes and loved the formulas and all that. I just do. But to break into that world, you really have to first know the rules to break the rules, I think. And so I've immersed myself in mysteries, and there's so many that are published every year. And my protagonist is an African-American lesbian and private investigator in Detroit. So she's not that typical. So when I go into those rooms, I have to know as much as the white guys know about Dashiell Hammett and Elmore Leonard and all those people before I can get some cred there. You know?
Okay, before I open it up for questions from you guys, I'm just going to ask one more question. If you could come up with any like essential queer syllabus for readers, just like top 3 that you would put on it.
Oh no.
Well, you start, I mean, James, you said it, James Baldwin needs to be on there.
That's it. Takes the cake.
I think Don't Call Us Dead by Denez Smith. Don't Call Us Dead by Denez Smith.
That's such a good book.
So good.
Oh my God.
Night Sky with Bullet Wounds. Did I say that right? I probably transposed the title.
Oh, Ocean Vuong's.
Ocean
Vuong.
Vuong, oh yeah.
I was so stuck on the title, I didn't say the author. I'm so sorry. And yeah, Sister Outsider, which I think I might reread almost on a yearly basis. So yeah.
The wheels
Round
are
and
turning.
I don't want to stop talking about these books.
I don't. Right. Oh my God, I got to look at my phone. Like I have an ongoing list.
I tell you, the people that I'm listening to now, it's so many poets. You know, Ocean Vuong, Natalie Diaz, Julian Randle. I mean, they're new, you know, but I love their stuff.
I forgot to use the microphone. Yes, refuse, yes. I'm the slam manager at Beltway Poetry Slam, which happens at Busboys and Poets the last Tuesday of every month. And he's going to be our feature, Julian Randle, this coming month. And when I heard, I'm like, yay! Because he's also giving a talk with Pages Matam the next night. And so when I think about knowing Julian before the book, and now knowing that I knew you could do that, I'm so glad you did that. That's great. We've known each other since The Watering Hole, where ironically Denez was our teacher, and also Terrence Hayes. And I think if I'm going to put that in the Hopper Refuse, I'd also say Deola Jones and Fatima Al-Asghar. I think those are contemporaries. Jericho Brown, doing the things that we need to be doing here. Those are poets. There's a lot of poets.
Not here. Hugh
Living
Min Wen.
poets, too.
That's a good one. I mean, he's always palling around with Denez, but that's a really good book. Not here. Hugh Min Wen, yeah. What else? I got to meet, he was really great, Henri Cole last summer, who was an amazing poet, was really funny, and like little pop cultural things he had was like, what are these Cheetos? People are eating these Cheetos, and these are fascinating. Another poet, David Tomas Martinez, is from San Diego. We went to the same college, and he's been someone who I write a lot about San Diego. He's been really great. I love Aaron Smith's Primer, which is a book. But this is one of the things I complain about with my classmates, especially because I write like really gay stuff, is like people don't write about like sex. And I'm like, are y'all having sex? Like, have you had? Like, sex is pretty great. Like, why are you not writing about it? And I really love how Aaron Smith writes in his poetry about sex and about desire and about lust.
Honestly, having that conversation, how when it's written about, it's probably me, but I'm usually like, oh, this is the stupidest sex scene I've ever read.
Right. But more often than not, I'm angry.
It's awkward. It's nasty.
Right.
And then I read Tyler French's book ahead of the publication and thought, ooh, y'all are gonna get some nasty stuff. Yay! So yeah, Tyler French's book just come out, and if I have to think of the title, I'm gonna get it wrong. So, but yeah.
No,
great
I
sex
love
scenes.
everything that Garth Greenwell is doing. Who else am I really loving?
I've got a couple in mystery. Kristen Lepianka, who's writing a new mystery series. Her protagonist is bisexual. We don't do enough about the B and the LGBTQ.
Absolutely, yeah.
John Copenhaver has a book called Dodging and Burning. It's a mystery, but it's literary fiction. There's a woman who writes out of New York. Her stuff is very accessible, but it's not well known, and she is a terrific writer. Her name is Ann Apteker, and she writes a series called the Cantor Gold series. Really gay, really gay.
Yes.
And set in the 40s in New York City.
So this is a great list. I'm also a Garth Greenwell fan. I was lucky enough to get to review his book, and I thought it was fabulous. I also, there's a book called Someday This Pain May Be Useful to You by Peter Cameron, which is like just so incandescent. It's a wonderful coming-of-age novel. And then there's a short story writer, Manuel Munoz. Like anytime you see a story by Manuel Munoz, like in a literary magazine, like buy the magazine. Like it's worth the cost of it just to read his story. He's such a sensitive writer. And then I love the poet James Cruise, not Cruise like Tom Cruise, but Cruise like a crew, rowing crew. And he has this one poem called Telling My Father that is, and it's actually the name of his collection, and it will break your heart every single time. So I read a lot of poetry, actually, and it's funny, I was very snobby about poetry when I was in college, and then I actually had to teach because like when you start teaching creative writing, you'll often get like the intro to creative writing and like poems. This is like one of the things you have to teach, and so I remember going to one of my classmates in my MFA program was a poet, and I was like, explain poetry to me, like I don't get it. And now, like, I just love reading poetry. And you learn so much, you know, any genre you do, you will learn from reading poetry. It takes such amazing concentration with language.
Can I just throw out two more names? And you've probably heard of her, Nicole Dennis Ben, who wrote Here Comes the Sun and Now Patsy's Out. She is a Jamaican writer and queer, and her stuff is very powerful. And then Chinelo Okparata, I think is how you pronounce her name, Caribbean American queer woman. Lots of good stuff coming out from African writers and Caribbean writers.
Great. I want to open it up for a few questions. Yeah.
I haven't formed this before saying it, but I've had a few conversations with older lesbians about, at some point in time that I wasn't alive for, lesbians would gather at lesbian bookstores and cafes. This could just be like a kind of lesbian spaces disappearing question, but I think it could even just be focused just on the bookstore since that was a big thing. And I really would like if you were as honest as possible, because I think I get the sense when I ask this question to folks that there's something they don't want to talk about, or some things they don't want to talk about, because gender is such a sensitive topic. But I'm really curious to know your thoughts about why you think lesbian bookstores are disappearing. Yeah.
The ones I know about that are disappearing is usually a financial reason. I mean, there was one in Toledo just a couple of years ago, and she was doing gangbusters, but then the rent got too high. I mean, I've heard about that happening in New York. I've heard that happening here, certainly here with Lambda Rising. Remember Lambda Rising, folks? I think it's partly financial. Books weren't selling as well as they're doing. They're having kind of a new period of eclipse because the ebook really ate into the hard book product line. And so you have to do something else in your bookstore. You either have to have some coffee or some people bringing some people in to sing and dance and have a little tchotchke and stuff like that. So it's hard, but some of them are coming back. There are a few that are starting to open up here and there. And you're right about it is totally a loss of community because also the LGBTQ bars are gone. And for lesbians, that one night we had at the LGBTQ bar is gone forever.
And it also, I think, speaks to, there's no sober spaces or spaces for youth, because where did the youth go?
When people say like, oh, well, youth are on social media now, I'm like, queer youth want daytime spaces to hang out anytime.
Real people.
So that's part of my confusion, is like the social media argument doesn't really do it for me.
Yeah, I mean, I would say too, a lot of it is the financial reason.
It's the G word. Y'all go ahead and say gentrification and let it be comfortable in your mouth. Because even busboys and poets, and you can see me raising my eyebrows, but even busboys and poets were forced out of their 5th and K location because the rent got too high. And they went across the street, but they, things are changing because there's a different tax bracket that moved in, and it continuously happens. I would love to say that I've lived in a city where it hasn't happened, but I've watched it happen in Miami, I've watched it happen here in DC, and I even watched it happen in Vienna where I live. Like, I go 2 blocks and I can live where I live, kinda, on a budget. I go 2 blocks the other way and I can't afford anything they have. And the 2 blocks the other way is where I work, my 4 jobs. So, it's the G word. And I'm going to reiterate that sadly it is a loss of community. I get really jealous of my friend Karen G, who posts pictures of Clitorati, which is a lesbian open mic down in Atlanta that happens inside of a bookstore. No mic, a lesbian no mic, because they can do it in a bookstore without a mic. And I would love to go to that once, but I can't drive all the way to Atlanta. I did that in one night, by the way. That's not a good idea. Don't do that to your body. So, I mean, if we want it, I think we have to build it ourselves.
I came back from Atlanta last night. I wish I knew.
And I think on top of gentrification, there's straightification. That our places have been taken in some, and it's part of that. We're so comfortable with queer people now. Let's go to tracks and dance. Straight people were going to tracks before it closed up. And coming to the bookstores and coming to the films and that energy takes over. When I went to Provincetown 2 years ago for Women's Week, which I had done something like 15 years before that. And when I went to Provincetown for Women's Week 15, 20 years ago, it was thick with lesbians. You couldn't walk down the street without bumping into a lesbian. It was magnificent, But this last time, there were tour buses and people with baby carriages and people getting off, husbands and wives getting off ships, and it was not the same.
Derrick and I were actually talking about that before. We were talking about Pride and how
It's a tourist trap.
It's very, I mean, tourism too comes into it. I'm thinking
No,
about
I mean
Rehoboth
tourism in a
as
different
well.
definition in that people
There
want to
was a
look
gay
around and
bookstore
look at the gay
there, And
guys.
then went back last year.
Rehoboth used to be so gay, and now it's not.
Yeah.
You're not wrong about that either. How corporate pride has become. It's the reason I stayed home.
Yeah, question.
Question for the panel. How many of you have read or been familiar with older Black lesbians like Anne Ellen Shockley, Cheryl Clark, Barbara Smith? Are you familiar with their work? You read their work? Would you recommend that younger lesbians read their work?
Certainly Barbara Smith and Anne Shockley, too, who's still alive. I belong to an organization called the Golden Crown Literary Society, and we're giving her an award this year. Anne Shockley, she's not able to attend because of health reasons, but her work is important. Cheryl Clark's work is certainly important. And Barbara Smith just got a Lambda Literary Award last week, you know. So they're around, and yes, we should know, like we know Audrey and Pat Parker, we should know them as well.
If you go to the back, there's a book called The Chambermaid Style Guide. It's written by Angelique Palmer, and the blurb on the back is from my friend Cheryl Clark. You know, when I got a chance to sit at her feet in New Mexico, I did. I knew how important that was. And we kept in touch, and I'm open to listening to anyone who wants to talk to me about those things, because I really want to talk about the history of Black queerness, of Black lesbians, I'm going to be frank, of Black lesbian writers who paved the way so that I can talk out loud.
So I am also a fan of Cheryl Clark's work. And in fact, I subscribe to Poem a Day from poets.org, which is like the best free thing in the world ever. And a poem by Cheryl Clark appeared in my email box, I think either yesterday or today. But I'm also a big fan of Cheryl's sister, Brina Clark.
Yes, Brina's so amazing.
Isn't she amazing? Who, so my very first, I've been on a tour, and my very first reading on the tour, Brina Clark walks into the bookstore at Jersey City, and I almost cried. Like, she's just, and the one thing that she has taught me, that I have just internalized, and I always am challenging myself to do, is radical empathy. She's like, if you want to write, it requires radical empathy, not just empathy, radical empathy.
I think probably one more question.
So along those lines of radical empathy, I'm always curious how writers keep from getting too pulled into the pain of their characters. This is something that I have struggled with. A plug for the Gold Crown Literary Society. I had a mentor who said that my characters were getting along way too well, and everything was too nice. And so I put in a lot more painful stuff because they had a lot, that they had a lot of conflict. And I was living that pain with them. And I just wonder how folks do that, because I find that I can do a little bit of that and then I have to step back, because if I am living too much with them and their pain, it can really like be too much for me.
I published this flash piece last year, and it took me a while to get to where it was in its kind of finished form. And it was about, essentially, it was about my cousin, who was the first real, like, gay person I knew, who was amazing and fabulous and was a child of the 80s and, like, had a lot of sex and did a lot of drugs and paid the cost, you know, died from AIDS in '89. But was this person who, like, introduced me to, like, Depeche Mode and studied abroad and showed me there was more to life than just kind of Southeast San Diego. And so in this story, this person has been this kind of iconic figure and probably knew I was a little baby gay even back then, and kind of extended that kindness to me. And wanting to really kind of write his story, it was too hard. It was too tough for me. And so what I ended up doing was kind of shifting this story, and to be frank, it probably made it even more difficult, but was to write about it from the perspective of his mother. So the mother my aunt, is his here after his death. And so the story doesn't end with his death. And then there's this whole kind of maternal aspect, right? But there was something about me being so focused on my cousin that I couldn't see, and really wanted to kind of honor him and his memory and what he meant to me as a person, and as a queer person. But redirecting that point of view opened the story up, and again made it maybe more difficult from an empathy standpoint. But I was able to kind of really write the story once I did that.
So I was sexually assaulted when I was a teenager, and it was something that I never talked about, never wrote about, didn't want anybody to know about me. And that's one of the main plot lines of this book. And so it was interesting. The question that you ask is very relevant here. And one of the things that really helped me, again, this idea, write about what you know about what you write. Just because something happened to you doesn't mean that you know about it. You have to research it, just like you would research, a refugee living in Cuba in 1922. And so I read a lot about writing about trauma and all the experience of trauma and people who had survived trauma. And one of the interesting things about it was that when people have been through a traumatic situation, not all the time, but they tend to remember it not as like a linear connect the dots documentary-like narrative. They tend to remember it in these flashes. Very vibrant flashes, and they often will key in on like the oddest of details that maybe even seem tangential to the actual experience of trauma, but just like linger, like, oh, and like while this was happening, I remember the smell of like cinnamon or something. And so that was very helpful to me. As I was writing this book, in the initial drafts, there's a rape scene, and I wrote it very, this happens, then this happens, like a documentary. And I don't know, have you guys ever seen that movie, The Accused, with Jodie Foster? And there's a gang rape scene in there, and it's so like by the numbers that it's almost like a porn fantasy of a rape because it's so documentary-like. And I think the more true evocation of that experience is through flashes. And selective detail, because details in art reverberate more loudly than they do in life. And so in a way it becomes both a coping mechanism for the artist, but it also becomes maybe a truer way to capture that experience.
I'm not answering your question, but I need to say, remember how the accuser, Kavanaugh's accuser, couldn't remember details, but there were flashes of, she couldn't remember how she got to the home, I think you're right about how trauma presents itself. So I'd like to get into the heads of my villains. I really like my villains. I know they're evil, but I do really like them. But I want to understand why they're evil and why they do the things they do. And so when I am deep into an emotional scene, then I have to go do something really physical, like dig with a shovel in my garden, or go for a run, or which I hardly ever do, or go to the gym, or lift furniture. I mean, I really have to I have to be up and sweating. I have to sweat.
Did you have anything to add?
Can I ask? There's one more person that kind of raised their hand when you said last question, and I'd love to hear his question if you.
Oh, well, I was thinking about sex. But what I was thinking about specifically was how, from the perspective of a gay teenager, the power of LGBT fiction is being able to see representations of gay teen sexuality in a positive way, right? Because a straight teenager is surrounded by common tropes of what it means to be dating in this like heteronormative way, and then for queer teenagers, they're kind of like wondering like, well, what does it look like? What does it mean to be falling in love with someone who is of the same sex, or maybe of an undefined gender, right? And so what was circulating through my head was how you as writers, do you feel a sense of responsibility or challenge, awareness that a teenager may be reading your work and searching for clues into their sexual orientation
So I have a true confession. I love John Hughes movies. And I particularly still have a crush on Jake Ryan from 16 Candles. And it's interesting because the actor who played that role has totally withdrawn. Like, you cannot find him online. Like, it's not like Keanu Reeves, where it's like you can still see what happened, who I also had a crush on and continue to have a crush. So
Always
anyway.
Be My Maybe is a great movie.
What's that?
Always Be My Maybe is a great movie. You should check it out.
Oh, okay. Add that to the list. So anyway, so I really, you know, when I wrote my story, like I was like, what would it be like to have that kind of story, but to be able to have like a same-sex couple at the center of it, and what would that look like? And it turns out that it's a pretty good plot line, because like it's, you know, especially in the 90s, forbidden love, you know, it's right there. So, and I certain, you know, I think it was Toni Morrison who said, write the book that you would like to read, you know. There's a book out there that's not being written that you really want to read, you should write it. And so I think like that for me is what this book is.
There's some really great YA fiction, LGBTQ YA fiction. I mean, I don't feel like I can write for young people. I don't have it in me, I don't think. Or I'm afraid I will corrupt them or something. But they're, you know, and Jacqueline Woodson and Carmen Miranda, thank you for helping out with that. But there's lots of good YA LGBTQ, I mean, really frank, and it worries me sometimes when I read it, but you know, librarians are vetting it and saying, yes, I'm going to put this in my young adult section.
It doesn't always have to be leaping off a bridge, kind of, I'm strange and different and nobody's going to understand me. I read enough of that when I was a kid. And so what I harken back to is the people who are better writers than I am, which are the poets I saw at Brave New Voices, and especially the DC Youth Slam teams, and there's a PYPM, which is I guess no more, but that's the Philly Youth Poetry Movement, and I saw a poet of trans experience do a poem called Ode to My Partner's Binder, which made me feel so much better about the world. And that it was a true and sheer love poem to the trans experience. And I'm like, you can do that? You can say that out loud? It doesn't have to be a sad story? And yeah, because they said, I own my experience. And that's bravery for me. I know it's coming, so, because they're the next wave of writers, and you know, they're going to take my job, whatever. But it's coming. The story you speak of, it's either it's being written right now, and it's good. So.
Being Emily is another one by Rachel Gold that I recommend.
Also, Julianne Peters I thought she was the only YA queer author when I was young, which is part of why this is interesting to hear, because I don't think it's advertised that. I thought she was the only lesbian YA author.
It's exploding now.
Yeah, now.
Yeah. And then I think fanfic has played a role too, you know? And you know, like this whole Klexicon movement where, you know, when Clark and Lexa were killed off in CW's...
Spoiler alert.
They were going like, oh, hell no. You know, and they started writing their own stories. And now it's like 12,000 of them who come together like a Comic-Con to keep that alive, that romance alive.
Yeah, I think, you know, just to end on what you said, Angelique, about, you know, it doesn't always have to be a sad story. You know, those original stories, I mean, lesbian pulp, they either had to die or end up with men, you know, just to get published. And, you know, that's why people were so outraged with the Clark and Lexa thing, because it was kind of hearkening back to that, okay, well, they can't be together. But I think when we're thinking about the future and what we're writing can pave the roads for at least give that little inkling of hope to the readers out there too. So I think we're going to end there. There's refreshments, drinks, snacks, and then please buy books from everyone up here. Thank you guys so much for chatting with me, and thank you guys for your questions and for
Thank
coming.
you for your thoughtful questions.